Okay, I'm doing this in Zoom to give it a try and see if I can get this right. And this is my practice presentation. So let's get started. And I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Here we go. And let's do that as a PowerPoint. And there's my PowerPoint. And this is called Finding Joy Through Punk, My Journey Through the MLA. And as you'll see, I started looking at MLA or master's programs, I should say, really, because I was feeling burned out. 15 years teaching the same courses to very similar students is tiring. And I was starting to become a little bored and flat. And I was looking for programs. At that time, I was looking for programs in folklore and or philosophy. And then the Higher Learning Commission came along. And the Higher Learning Commission told pretty much all the community colleges in this region, or in the region at the North Central, that, hey, you guys have too many unqualified people teaching. They need credentials. I love teaching philosophy. I didn't have 18 hours. So that kind of made a decision of a field, though I was still playing with a field when I started Baker. And I had looked at a couple other schools, and I looked at local schools in Arkansas because there are an MLA and a Master's of Interdisciplinary Studies, but they required physical residence, and I couldn't do that because it was too far away. I don't drive at night anymore. My diabetes has made my eyes kind of bad. And I was down to 2 online programs. UNC Greensboro had an MLA program at the time, and Baker had their MLA program. And by far and away, Baker had much better selection of classes, in my opinion. So I was accepted, I started, and I was looking for, as I said in the very first paper, intellectual stimulation. And it was that I found at Baker. And the variety of courses have not failed me at all. And I started by talking about my creative artifacts, because they led to my threads. And the first one is my artifact map for Tales of the Kits and Pits Clowder. And the Kits and Pits Clowder connects 2 courses, children's literature and the power of myth. And the artifact itself is 2 short stories based on the trickster idea from Dr. Lo Wiso, and it illustrates a connection between community and empathy and trying to build a community, and it illustrates resistance or rebellion by portraying a happy family made up of pit bulls and cats, something that's never supposed to happen. And the joy here came from creative writing. I hadn't done that in a very long time. And being able to write these stories and connect them to my life was really fun and enjoyable and gave me a lot of pleasure. And then my second artifact is my college research artifact, Generation Y, Work Ethic, and Parenting. A change is going to come. And my map looks a little different because the first map was just too messy to make sense of. And I was learning how to do maps in PowerPoint. Well, that'll come in handy because I'm a do-it-yourself kind of girl. And this was for my sociology course, Generation Text. And I really ultimately enjoyed the course, but I struggled a lot. In part because we were dealing with outdated views of millennials. The textbook was viewing millennials still in high school, and reality said millennials were workforce age, and we were seeing Generation Z in high schools. So it was outdated. It had a lot of bad stereotypes of millennials as spoiled, participation trophy, not interested, not buying in people, and I wasn't jiving with what I saw. So ultimately, I wanted to argue that millennials through technology were changing work ethic and parenting, and they were using they used the developmental work ethic for more of a life-work balance. And that was an important phase in that because it was resisting what everybody else was saying, and that included the millennials in the class, that it was just really negative energy there, and I just did not like it. So this paper gave me a way out of that. My third artifact is the critical thinking artifact, and it came from it's called How Far Have We Come? The Ambivalent States of Civil Rights, and it came out of a history course on the civil rights movement, taught by Dr. Cooper, by the way. And we had to argue the successes and failures of the civil rights movement. And to be fair, when I looked at it, and this was in 2015 originally, and I brought it up to date for this course, but the civil rights movement, it was successful, but it's also had a lot of failures. And at the time, it was police brutality going on and riots in Ferguson, in Detroit for the Philando Castiles, in Baton Rouge, and so forth for all of these accidental deaths of African American men. So I was talking about that, and right around that same time, the Voting Acts, there had been the repeal of the Voting Acts, Voting Rights Act, excuse me. And we were starting to see a lot of these things go into place, limiting who could vote or trying to control it. And that's a tailspin. And the same was true. I also looked at women's rights and LGBTQ rights, because it's the same year gay marriage was approved by the Supreme Court. Is also the same year that we started seeing all the anti-trans bathroom laws and all the rollbacks on women's reproductive rights. And my ultimate conclusion was we had come a long way, but we still had a lot of work to be done. And it was a rough paper to write. It was kind of depressing. Now I move on to my philosophy concentration artifacts. And the first one I wrote for Dr. Clark, and it's called Coverture, Imagery, Fantasy, or Why Women Are Not Libertarians. And it was written in 2016, the year of the election. And it was written for Ethics in the Age of Self-Interest. And at the time, there were all kinds of articles about why women weren't into libertarianism. And, if you just look at it, it sounds like women should be, because it's all about owning your own body. So I was interested in that. I wanted to look at it. So I looked at libertarianism, and libertarianism draws from social contract theory. So I started getting interested in social contract theory. And that comes out of Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. But neither one of those really leave a lot of room for women, in part because social contract theory is based on marriage contracts, or at least marriage contracts at the time fed into it and from previous times. And those allowed for coverture, which is the idea that when a man and a woman get married, the woman's rights disappear and they are submerged into his rights. And coverture reading stuff about coverture is pretty depressing. But I'm familiar with 18th century literature, and I was familiar with 18th century feminism anyway, so I wasn't unaware of these issues. And coverture, but I was surprised to find coverture involved with libertarianism to such a degree, because the language of modern libertarianism is still very patriarchal. A lot of the imagery is very patriarchal, and when it's not, it's patronizing, and that tends to drive women away. And while I was doing that, I found the feminist theories of Susan Oken and Carol Pateman on this, who were arguing that the marriage contract and the social contract, they're the ones who argued that they're connected. And they were also arguing that this was a real problem for libertarian and social contract theory. Oken, if I'm remembering correctly, actually makes a case for abortion rights on the idea that if the woman owns her own body, and I may be conflating some sources, her body is the one that does the primary work on creating the child. When the child is born, is that her property, and if it's her property, she can do whatever she wants with it. And it leads to that, and her critique of it is it leads to this idea that children, at least until they're of an age to be in control of themselves, are property. And and she was pointing out it's a really slippery slope when you start going that way. And it was a critique of both social contract and libertarianism that I was reading. It was a fascinating paper to write. Not as fascinating as the second concentration paper I have here, which is simulation argument and externalism. Does simulation argument presume too much? This came out of Dr. Usura's no, critical thinking on current issues. I confused the two classes because they were so close together. And it started by rejecting Elon Musk and Nick Bostrom's argument that we live in a computer simulation. Bostrom actually, when you read Bostrom and the work he's done, he doesn't believe in it. It's just a thought experiment. But the problem with the thought experiment, I think, is in the very opening premises, because nowhere does he ever account for the idea of external reality. And I mean, if the essay itself led me to explore a lot more philosophical concepts about perception and reality and subjective idealism, and I pulled in both John Locke and George Berkeley, and basically I was arguing if for both of them, the external reality, if there is one, in the case of Berkeley there is not, it's all about what the person perceived, S-A-S, percepi, or percepi. And if it's all perception, then does it really matter if those perceptions are from external perceptions are generated by a computer or by senses? They would still be real to the brain that felt them, which led me to basically argue that the simulation argument is really just another brat in a vein, brain in a vat. I gotta get that right. Brain in a vat. And the slide is because when I was doing this, I found out there's actually a punk band called Brain in the Vat, which amuses me greatly. This leads me to my artifact threads paper. In thinking in all these and weaving them together, I had a tough time coming up with this. What I ended up tying it together and working with was one of the reasons I came back to school was because I was bored and I needed joy. I needed to find the joy in teaching and in learning again. And we had talked about Montori's joy of inquiry and creative inquiry, and that seemed to click for me because when I look back, ultimately, even the courses I struggled the most with, and in fact, some of the courses I struggled the most with were the ones I enjoyed the most. So the joy of inquiry seemed to be a central thread for me, and out from that thread kind of came some of the things that went with that joy, which were community building, building connections, empathy, resistance, and skepticism, and joy itself. So that when I wrote the paper, I was thinking in terms of this, and my thesis for that was the ultimate theme of my work is the joy of inquiry, the joy of learning, finding and making connections between various ideas and groups, indeed in parts of my own life and work, approaching concepts from a place of resistance for the pleasure I receive from the challenge of the intellectual struggle itself, and finding ways to create empathy and build communities through rekindling my joy of learning. Rekindling my joy in learning allows me to share that joy with my students and hopefully help them to find their own joy in the inquiry. And I don't always talk about the teaching part in my work, my student work, but almost everything I've done has linked back in some way to my teaching. Every course I enrolled in because it could give me something in class to teach from or would help my teaching. The Artifact Threads paper itself, I started with my return to school to find joy in learning and teaching, and I discussed Alfonso Montori's Inquiry of Joy. That's the idea that we should go into our academic or any creative endeavors looking for what makes us happy. And he talks about passion, I can't say it, connivability, this is community building, looking at power dynamics, and so forth. And all of these were things I enjoyed. And I realized I found my joy through these connecting of various bits of knowledge, like in the simulation argument, connecting Berkeley, Locke, Putnam, Bostrom, and there are a couple other names in there. Looking at and seeing the connection between those. The same is true for looking at Locke and Hobbes and social contract theory, which can tie in Rousseau and goes into an ethics and pulling all that together. pulling in my real life because I was an 18th century Romanicist scholar in a previous academic life. So all of that showed up in my various artifacts. And one of the things that I don't explicitly say in this paper, but which is true, is taking control of my learning brings a lot of joy, that struggle. And I struggled. Dr. Yusura knows I struggled because we had some interesting discussions when it came to paper topics. But it's also my joy and resistance that led me to find something that really seems to work for me, and that's punk pedagogy. Now, each artifact in this paper illustrated some element that brought me joy or brings joy to me. The intellectual challenge, and that joy carries over into my teaching. And I took things from my courses and applied them to my work. From something like Dr. Loiso's The Power of Myth, I pulled in the Popol Vuh for World Lit. I had never taught it. My students loved it. And they were able to connect the modern world to the ancients in a way that I hadn't done before. So in a way, well, not in a way, totally, Baker's MLA successfully rekindled my joy of learning and teaching. Then there's my capstone paper. That map in front of you is like one of 12 before I could finally get myself together. And in my capstone paper, I spend a lot of time talking about punk pedagogy and teaching, coming up with my own pedagogy, and not a lot about connections, but the connections are done in the work. But punk pedagogy is, which you'll hear a little bit more about in a second. It was interesting to come up with a map for me. And my thesis for this paper, in examining these threads, my graduate work here at Baker, I discovered punk pedagogy, a school of teaching philosophy that focuses on resistance. And using this lens to examine my work here at Baker, I have developed a personal pedagogy that combines punk pedagogy with the joy of learning and the joy of making connections. And the capstone paper, my big lens is punk pedagogy. And punk pedagogy is exactly what it says. It draws from punk music, and it draws from the accompanying culture that surrounds it. And punk theory has come a very long way from Seth Klarnigan's work down to a great deal of philosophy, and it shows up in every field in some ways, and it's a really interesting idea. And it has, according to Seth Klarnigan, who in 1998, wrote Pedagogy of the Pissed, Punk in the First Year Classroom. And he gave, one of the things that this article keeps coming up for is it has 5 basic characteristics of the punk ethos that apply to pedagogy. DIY, the do-it-yourself idea. This lets students buy into their education. Passion. There is nothing but passion in punk rock. Resistance. Pain and struggle. And pleasure. And it's the pleasure of challenging yourself, so it ties into struggle. But these form the lens in which I examine my Baker coursework. It also links really tightly to Montuori's creative inquiry. A, Montuori was in a punk band. And B, his dimensions of creative inquiry and those 5 characteristics of punk match up almost one for one, except for the pain part. Montuori doesn't seem to focus on that one as much, but it's in there because he's always looking at and mentioning power dynamics. His manifesto is for the initial journal of creative behavior. That manifesto is about as punk a document as you're going to ever find in academia. After exploring how this stuff looked through my coursework, which is that certain courses fit better than others, I moved on to my personal pedagogy, and I am personally pragmatic. I find myself attracted to some of John Dewey's ideas, especially when it comes to active education, and that the inquiry has to be active, it can't be passive, and it has to have some sort of purpose, and this leads ultimately to a more democratic View, that actually fits in really well with punk. Um, both in my punk pedagogy work, Dylan Smith, Mike Dines, Estrella Torres, all kind of mention Dewey, as does Montefiore. So at some point after this process, I'm probably going to be delving into some Dewey. That sounds wrong. Uh, to find out more. What I know is it takes lots of preparation because you're going to have to teach students the do-it-yourself attitude. You're going to have to teach resistance, and you're going to have to do this via critical thinking. So the work we did with Elder and Paul will not be lost, even though it's not my favorite model. It also has to be student-centered so that they can discover their passions. And I figure if I can pull all of that together, I have improved and I will rekindle my joy of teaching as well as their joy of learning. And I know to some extent some of this works because since I've been at Baker, I put in place some of this, such as more videos in my online class, which my students seem to adore. More group projects and more creative projects in some of my composition classes. My second composition class, which is like an intro to lit class, we do primarily fairy tales, and instead of a character analysis, now they have to tell it from one of the lesser known characters' point of view. They have to write their own. They have to make a video. In my philosophy class, they have to do a comic strip. So I'm pulling in a lot of these things I've seen and learned from Baker into my own teaching. And ultimately, that's the goal. So what are my conclusions here? Baker's program has been very successful in reinvigorating my joy in learning and rekindling my joy of teaching. Punk pedagogy, which I rediscovered technically, I had read an article and that was it. Punk pedagogy allows me a way to share my love of learning with my students. Montefiore's creative inquiry is going to inform my lifelong learning and my life of teaching. So that in coming to Baker, I have found, as that slide says, my creativity and my individuality. And lastly, I want to give some acknowledgments to my mom, to my husband, without whom I probably would never have thought of punk rock. And you can blame him for a lot of the music references. To Dr. Cooper, who has been more than patient with me and everyone. To my Baker faculty, who have been fabulous instructors. To my PCCUA colleagues here who have put up with my stress, my whining, my freaking out. And to my students who are the inspiration for all this. Thank them all. The end. Uh, I mean, there's my reading. Sorry, that won't happen. Okay, that's better at least. Okay, it doesn't want to go full screen on me. All right, well, we'll see how long that is, and you guys can tell me. I already saw a couple of things I've got to fix in the PowerPoint, so we'll see what's up. All right, I'm going to stop.